All right, class, this is Mr. Beller coming at you from the uh, space of the internet. This is the second installment of the lecture series on the Revolutionary War. Just to back up a little bit, the last series of lectures, we discussed the French and Indian War. We looked at the causes of the war, the tension between Great Britain and France, and how they were clashing over the Ohio Valley. We looked at the outcome of the war. That Great Britain was able to defeat the French and establish themselves as the dominant force of of North America. And then we looked at some of the problems that the British victory brought um, in regards to their relationship with the American colonies, namely due to the fact that the British have to pay for this war, and they have decided that the colonies need to help them out in paying off the debt that occurred as a result of this war. Um, and so we saw in 1763 the end of salutary neglect, and we saw that Great Britain started to enforce some changes here that caused the colonies to resist, rebel, and ultimately revolt. This series of lectures will look at the conflicts between Great Britain and America, and we'll look at these conflicts grow over the issues of taxation, representation, and liberties. And why does this section matter? Is because these events are going to be the ones that shape the American Revolution, and they're also seen as a turning point in the humanity's fight for freedom. You look at some of the key terms that we'll be discussing today. Make sure that you understand the main idea. Make sure you could explain the main idea, and make sure you would be able to define or explain the significance of these key terms after watching these videos. All right, so let's get down to it. We last looked at the British issuing the Proclamation of 1763. King George says no colonist can settle past this line, this proclamation line, which is essentially the Appalachian Mountains. No colonist could settle in the Ohio Valley. The British don't want any more conflicts with the Native Americans, and King George III feels like this is a good way to stop that. The Parliament and King George III also passed the Sugar Act in 1764. This was an act that would tax certain goods, namely sugar and molasses, that would affect the colonists. And so the next series of parliamentary acts that we want to focus on starts with the Stamp Act. In March of 1765, Parliament and George Grenville, who is Prime Minister of Great Britain, passed the Stamp Act. This Stamp Act required colonists to purchase special stamp paper for every legal document, licenses, newspapers, pamphlets, almanacs, pretty much anything you could think of, colonists had to buy this stamp paper. Even playing cards and dice. People who disobeyed these laws were tried in what's called vice admiralty courts. These vice admiralty courts are a court where one judge would decide the ruling. Instead of being tried by a jury of your peers, one judge will decide if you're innocent and guilty. And so you start to see the colonists organized groups of resistance to lead efforts to boycott or refuse to buy or purchase goods that would support the Stamp Act. Some of these resistance groups are the Sons of Liberty. This was led by a man named Samuel Adams. And the actions that they took, they harassed custom workers, they harassed stamp agents, they harassed royal governors, they led efforts to boycott British goods that would be supported under the Stamp Act. Some other actions that the colonists took is that you saw individual colonial assemblies. These are like the governments of the colonies. These colonial assemblies, such as Virginia, said that colonists could only be taxed by their own representatives. This is the whole idea of no taxation without representation. You also saw that colonies would start to unite together. This is one of the first examples where you start to see colonies unite for a common cause. Before 1763, and especially before the Stamp Act, you really saw the colonies view each other like foreign countries would. You know, we live on the same continent, and we might be part of the British Crown, but the similarities end there. You start to see a change here, and colonies will unite together. And then one of the first examples of this would be the Stamp Act Congress. You have 9 colonies uniting together, and they write up this document called the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. Essentially, they're telling the Crown that they don't believe in Parliament's right to tax the colonists. Why? Because the colonists don't feel like they're actually represented. In the Stamp Act Congress, you hear the cries of no taxation without representation. You hear them, essentially ask the British, show us where our representation is in Parliament, and we will pay this tax. You start to see the Parliament and the colonies engage in this debate over what representation actually is. Parliament says that just under the sheer fact that the colonists are colonies of Great Britain, they are virtually represented in Parliament. That's not going to be good enough for the colonists. They want actual representation in Parliament. And until they feel like they are represented, they refuse to pay these taxes. And so, how does Parliament respond to colonial protest? How does Parliament respond to this first test, or this first act of resistance against parliamentary rule, or this new policy that Great Britain is trying to enforce towards the colonies? Well, they said, okay, you win this battle. And they repealed the Stamp Act. They got rid of the Stamp Act. But as the colonies rejoice, they feel like they have a huge victory in this debate over taxation and representation. As the colonies are rejoicing, and as they feel like they've won this little battle over Parliament, Parliament also passes an act that gets ignored by the colonists. They pass what's called the Declaratory Act. This Declaratory Act said that Parliament had the right to make laws for colonists in any cases whatsoever. So why the colonists are rejoicing, they ignore the fact that Parliament says, yes, okay, we will do what you want. We will repeal the Stamp Act. However, make sure you know who the boss is. Make sure you know that Parliament still has the right to make laws over you. This is going to be key, because the colonists say, hey, we've won. We've persuaded the Parliament to see it our way. And the Parliament's essentially saying, no, not so fast. And so this debate over taxation and representation will continue, and tensions will only grow worse. You see, a couple years later, Parliament and the British Prime Minister Charles Townshend, now 1767, says, okay, you had some beef over what's called direct taxes, taxes enforced solely for the purpose of making revenue. We'll go back to the way we did taxes before. We'll do something called indirect taxation. And so these Townshend Acts essentially are taxes that focused on imported materials, things like glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. However, now the colonists are seeing these acts in a different light. They're on the train of representation. They say that the Townshend Acts, even though they are similar to forms of taxation that were agreed upon before, no longer would this suffice. And so the colonists once again react with protest and boycotts against what they call taxation without representation. And you see, once again, colonists will boycott British products, and you start to see Americans, especially American women, get involved in these boycotts, and they start making their own cloth. They start making their own tea. you start to see the colonists get really creative in ways to survive without these British products that they depended on for so long. And this is going to be something that's similar to the way that the colonists reacted to the Stamp Act. As tensions rise in the colonies, the British are going to station 2,000 soldiers in Boston. So just imagine here that that tensions are starting to get a little worse. They're starting to grow, and now all of a sudden Parliament's going to put 2,000 soldiers, essentially a symbol of what the colonists see as British tyranny. The soldiers are a symbol of the crown trying to enforce these taxes, which the colonists see as not fair. And this will only make matters worse. And on a cold and snowy night in March of 1770, you see an armed clash between colonists and British soldiers that will become known as the Boston Massacre. These colonists are starting to taunt these soldiers. This taunting eventually turns violent, where rocks and snowballs are thrown at the soldiers. No one really knows if the order to fire was actually given out. All we know is that a shot was fired into the crowd, and when the dust settles, you see American colonists dead at the hands of the British soldiers. And Paul Revere, who is an engraver, runs a newspaper business, he comes up with this picture that the PowerPoint slide is depicted, where you see this event labeled as a massacre, the Boston Massacre, and you see what appears to be British soldiers lined up and just firing indiscriminately into a crowd of American colonists. It wasn't really a massacre, but it was used as propaganda against the British. It was used as a way to rally support to resist these acts by Parliament. You see, a couple years later, in 1772, the Committees of Correspondence established. This is going to be established by Sam Adams, and this is just another example of the colonies uniting in resistance to these parliamentary acts. The Committees of Correspondence was a way for colonies to communicate with each other about what the British were doing, about what liberties were being suppressed, and ways to counter acts by Parliament. I wish I could tell you that things got better, but we see as these acts are being enforced, and the colonists are reacting and resisting and boycotting these measures by Parliament, we are actually moving closer to what will become known as the start of the American Revolution. The next big event would be the Boston Tea Party. In 1773, the British East India Company was actually facing bankruptcy. They were facing bankruptcy because of these colonial boycotts against British tea. I told you that, as a result of these things like the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, that colonists were making their own goods and, in fact, making their own tea, which hurt this British East India Company. So the Prime Minister passed what's called the Tea Act. This actually freed the company from having to pay any taxes, and actually made the tea cheaper. And this was a way that, the Prime Minister thought that he could trick the colonists into actually supporting an act by Parliament, and in turn it would also help out this company. However, the colonists were not fooled by the Tea Act. They knew it was a trick by the British, and instead of buying the tea, Boston rebels dumped 18,000 pounds of tea into the harbor. This is known as the Boston Tea Party. And as a response to that, the British Parliament passed the Intolerable Acts, which essentially shut down the Boston harbor, did not allow any goods to come into Boston as a way to punish the Bostonians for the act of defiance. It allowed British soldiers to stay in vacant homes, and it placed Boston under martial law. Essentially, this placed it under the rule of the military. How did the colonies respond to the Intolerable Acts? Well, with the First Continental Congress, These delegates from the colonies wrote up a Declaration of Rights saying the colonies could run themselves, supported the actions of the protests in Massachusetts, and they would fight